Hi there, Read 536. This is Dr. Keisler. This week we're going to go into our second part of our triangulated analysis, which is analyzing our programs for best practices. So before you continue listening, I would like you just to take a moment and figure out which version of our best practices in literacy instruction text you have. So some of you may still have the 4th edition. I sometimes find each semester I have 1 or 2 students that have that. Most of you likely have the best practices 5th edition. If you have the older version, the 4th edition, please stop listening here and go listen to the other set of screencasts that I've provided. The rest of this lecture is going to focus on doing the assignment in regards to the way that best practices were described in the 5th edition. So it's not that the best practices have changed, because they're best practices, but what is different is how the text organized those. So in the 4th edition, each chapter laid out the best practices as a set of guidelines that should be followed. And in the best practices 5th edition, they went with a little bit more of a conceptual approach. So the way that I describe the assignment is a little bit different, and the examples I use are a little bit different, but the core content is still the same. So if you have the old book, just go ahead and listen to and do your assignment as described in the 4th edition set of screencasts. And if you have the new version, then continue listening here and do your assignment as described in this text. So what are we going to do this week? So, unlike Mr. Bart Simpson there, who is not showing us evidence of a best practice by copying something over and over again on the board, we are going to look at our programs for evidence of the use of best practices. So these will be the best practices as described in both your text or best practices that you learned or read about and added to on your study sheet from the articles that you either read yourself or that you read from the discussion forum that one of your classmates posted. So I'm going to walk you through an example using the same program that I used for the triangulated analysis piece. See if I can just pull it up over here. I'm going to put you on pause for a second. Okay, so here's my program. Remember, I was looking at 3rd grade of the Wonders reading program. So you have a decision to make before you begin, and this is going to be based on how your program is organized. So in these big commercial reading programs like Wonders, it's probably sufficient for you to go ahead and take a look at the best practices covered for 1 week in 1 unit. So the reason being that the routine doesn't change very much from week to week. So you kind of do the same thing with the students. The only thing that kind of changes is maybe an activity or 2 or the strategy that you focus on and then the story that you're covering, right? So for my program, I can get a good enough idea of the type of vocabulary practices they use by simply looking at how they teach vocabulary for 1 week. So if you were doing vocabulary using a different program, you might need to look at more than 1 week. You may need to look at more than 1 unit. It kind of depends on how your program is set up. So I'm going to leave it up to you to be the best judge for how big your view needs to be in terms of what you're going to look at to do your analysis. If you have a program similar to this, similar to Wonders, then 1 week is probably quite sufficient. So what you want to do is you want to go through how they teach, whatever they're teaching, whatever area of literacy that you're focused on. So in my case, I'm looking at vocabulary. And I'm going to make a list of all of the practices that happen related to vocabulary for that week. What I also did was I went ahead and I flipped into the next week to see if the routines changed any bit. If I saw any significant changes, I could then pull those and include those activities in my best practices. But likely from week to week, there's not a huge difference in what the students are going to do, particularly with something like vocabulary. You'll get a little bit more of a change if you were looking at comprehension, a little bit more of a change if you were looking at writing, but again, your overall routines and instruction kind of stays the same, and it's just some of the strategies that that change, or the content piece that changes. So when I look through here, I'm looking for this routine for vocabulary, right? So I see here on day 1, they do this activity called words in context. I know that this program has these vocabulary cards. The cards have a visual on them. The students are going to define the words, and then they're going to find the words used in context. And I can find more of a description of that in the teacher's guide itself. But what I first want to do is kind of look through and find all the vocabulary related activities. So I see here it's introduced in day 1. Then I see that we've got this differentiated instruction. I see vocabulary popping up in all of my differentiated small group activities. So I'm going to want to take a look at what's different in terms of what they're doing. I already like the fact that it is differentiated for their vocabulary. I go ahead and I look at their language arts piece. They're going ahead and they're doing more activities related to vocabulary. They're working on academic vocabulary. And then I go ahead into my other days. I see here they're going to do a strategy working with metaphors and their vocabulary for the week. They're going to do an activity to review their vocabulary words in each of, or in at least 2 of their differentiated groups. I'm going to notice that it's my on-grade level, my approaching grade level here, and it's my ELL, so I'm going to want to take a look at that. They're doing vocabulary here again with the whole group for language arts instruction, and then so on and so forth. So you can see I kind of go through and I find where they've done the vocabulary here. But then what I want to do is, once I've pulled it off of my planning sheet, I want to go ahead and I'm going to look at my actual program. So if you've got a teacher's guide, you're going to be doing, you know, pretty much the exact same thing here. You're going to look at your weekly planner, your unit planner. You're going to find everywhere that vocabulary is discussed. And then you're going to go ahead and you're going to go into the program to see how it's actually delivered, because that'll illuminate for you how they're actually implementing the best practices, right? So now that I've made my little list, I can go ahead and I can look at how they do that. So I see here they're doing some introduction, tapping some schema. They do their, I think I passed it. They do their read aloud piece. And then I go ahead and I find my 10-minute vocabulary lesson. And so this describes the words in context strategy that they are going to use. So I can read about that, and I'm going to use that to write up my description of the best practice, or actually the activity that I see them using. And then I'm going to go in to my best practices study sheet, or I'm going to go back into my chapter, and I'm going to see if I can find or if I can make a connection to the activity being described for vocabulary here and the best practices described in my reading. So I want to go ahead and I want to do that for everywhere that I wrote down. I saw the students doing vocabulary. So here I can kind of see what they did. This is the words in context routine. They look at the visual vocabulary cards. They get these definitions. They do some discussions with a partner. And then they come back and they do the discussion with the teacher. And I can really see what they're doing here. I know what the cards look like. I see what their practice page looks like. I don't have it here, but the practice page looks different for the different groups because there's this focus on differentiated instruction here. And then I'm going to want to go ahead and I'm going to want to find what they do related to vocabulary for the rest of the week. So you are going to do something very similar. So I'm going to switch us in a moment and I'm going to show you the example that I have and how you can go ahead and relate this to the best practices. Let's see. All right, so here's my best practices template. So you see here the program, practice, instruction, or activity. So I made it kind of broad because you may need this. So I gave an overview that each week 8 vocabulary words are presented to students. There are words for the week, and this week the topic was inventions, so that's what they were relating it to. And I described what I just saw there in the teacher's guide. Words presented using a visual vocabulary card. The card has a picture. For each word, students are provided with a sentence using the word and a student-friendly definition. Students then work with a partner to discuss the sentences and the meaning of each word, and each student then selects 3 words and writes a question about that word with their partner. So now what I do is I want to look at that activity and I want to say to myself, okay, is this a best practice? So, I've lost my buttons. Alright, I'm sorry about that. This screencast does not like when I'm flipping back and forth between the documents. So I'm going to try to not flip back and forth as much since this is the second time I've tried to record this screencast. So when I want to think about the best practices now, we've read the textbook chapter on our area of literacy. So mine is vocabulary, and in each chapter they kind of give this visual that describes some of the broad areas of best practices in that area of literacy. So you'll see in vocabulary, they have this, center of, or their topic is multifaceted, comprehensive vocabulary instruction. And they've got these 4 categories or 4 elements that they believe make up a comprehensive vocabulary program, right? So they've got fostering word consciousness, teaching word learning strategies, providing rich and varied language experiences, and teaching individual words. So as I read in the chapter, I find that they expand on each of these. So I can use these as descriptors of the best practices that I found, and then I can go ahead and I can specifically discuss how I think the activity as described in the teacher's guide meets or embodies or is evidence of that element of vocabulary instruction. So let me see if I can flip my next thing up without scaring my screencast schematic here. Yeah, see, it doesn't like it, but we're going to see what happens. And so you'll see right here for that first activity, the teacher teaches individual, general academic, and domain-focused vocabulary. So in my chapter, when they talked about teaching individual words, this is one of the practices they described, right? They described that for teaching individual words, the teacher would teach individual, general academic, or domain-focused vocabulary, and then they gave me ideas of what that might look like. So then I go ahead and I write my description for how I believe these link. So this introductory lesson for weekly vocabulary words follows the example for a simple individual word lesson as described on page 204 in the text. This lesson combines definitional instruction, active processing, and allows students to connect their prior knowledge to the new words. So that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to figure out, okay, these are the practices that the program wants me to do. Can I go in and can I see that these are described as best practices? That will not always be the case, all right? You can also show multiple examples of evidence for the same best practice. So you're going to see that I have in this idea of individual vocabulary several times, but my description of how that practice meets that is different every time. But then you'll see I don't have evidence for some of it, and that's okay. You can just leave some of those blank if you cannot find evidence that that is a best practice. Don't leave it off, because this is going to be valuable to you later on when you're doing your overall triangulated analysis, because you can say, they do several, activities throughout the week related to vocabulary that are not evidence of best practice. All right, let's see if I can find my screencast-o-matic back again. Okay, I've got it back. So that's what you're doing this week. You're going to go ahead, you're going to look at your program, you're going to find the activities that they do for vocabulary or for comprehension or what they do for writing or for phonics instruction. And then you're going to look at that best practice and you're going to look at that activity and you're going to say, all right, does this provide evidence that this activity is indeed a best practice as described in my text? So also make sure that you go ahead on Titanium and look in the folder of all of the resources that I've provided for you and take a look at some of the student samples as well. I think you'll find them helpful.